snow kept falling without end, and the wind howled outside the thin fabric walls of his tent, and the fire was already weak and flickering, and the heat was not enough for one person, let alone two, and Ethan rubbed his hands together and looked around nervously, and he was still trying to process what had happened earlier when he found the alien girl unconscious near the frozen lake, and her skin was pale silver with a faint glow, and she looked fragile like glass but still breathing, and he had carried her back without thinking, because no one should die in the cold, and not like that. He had placed her gently inside the tent and wrapped her in every piece of cloth he had, and even gave her his sleeping bag, and she didn't speak when she opened her eyes but stared at him with glowing blue pupils that widened and shimmered like oceans, and for a moment he felt like she could see everything about him and everything inside him, and it made his chest tighten with something he couldn't name now. She sat there on the corner of the tent with steam rising from her shoulders and her breath warm and visible in the cold. And she didn't look afraid, and she didn't look weak anymore, and Ethan noticed how still she sat, like a statue, and her silver hair spilled across the blanket like threads of light. And then she turned and looked at him again, and this time she moved closer and closer without a word, and without blinking Ethan felt his heart beat faster, and he reached for a canteen just to do something, and he offered it to her with a shaky smile, and she took it slowly and drank, and then stared at the water like it was something she didn't understand. And finally she spoke, and her voice was soft like music but carried weight like thunder trapped under calm skies. Your kind burns easily here, but you came for me anyway, and I do not understand. That he didn't know what to say, because her words were not angry and not thankful either, and more like curious and deep and old, and her eyes never left his, and it made him nervous, and he tried to laugh, but it came out broken, and he just nodded and said he couldn't leave someone to freeze. And she tilted her head and asked again, why would a creature with such short life risk it for another without knowing what she was? He had no answer, and neither did the wind, which grew louder outside, and the tent flapped like wings trying to escape the ground, and he looked down and avoided her gaze, but she leaned even closer now, and her hand reached out and touched the edge of his coat, and then his chest, and then stopped. You are warm, she said, and her voice was closer now, and he could feel her breath, and something shifted in the air like a change in pressure before a storm, and her fingers were cold like metal, and yet he didn't flinch, and he didn't step back, and instead he asked if she needed more clothes and pointed toward his pack, and she shook her head slowly and said she needed something else. Without warning, she reached out and touched the side of his neck, and everything inside him froze, and not from fear but from something ancient and strange and electric, and images flashed in his head, and they were not his memories and not hers, but something else entirely, and alien skies and broken ships and battles in places without names and voices that sounded like stars crying. He gasped and pulled back, and she also moved away, but slowly, and her expression unreadable, and she whispered that the link had started, and now she knew who he was and what he feared and what he wanted, and she said that was enough for her to decide what comes next. And Ethan stared at her, confused and scared and curious and unsure if he was even awake or dreaming. Then she stood slowly and walked toward the tent flap and pulled it open just slightly and stared into the blizzard like she saw something far away, and she turned back to him and said they were coming, and they had seen the light, and now they would not stop, and he needed to decide quickly if he was going to run or hide or fight. Ethan asked who was coming, and she just said the ones that left her behind. And they did not forget, and they did not forgive. And then she looked at him again and said, if you want to live, do not think I only came to warm up. Then the light outside flickered, and shadows moved fast across the snow, and the tent shook like the ground was alive, and Ethan reached for his gear, and his breath caught in his throat, because he knew something big had just started, and there was no going back now. And whatever she was, she had brought something with her, and it was already here. Ethan sat frozen as the alien girl crawled closer with slow movements, like a wild creature trying not to scare its prey, and her eyes never left his face, as if watching every breath, every blink, every shift in his body. And her silver fingers touched the edge of the blanket and pulled it slowly, as if testing its texture. Or maybe testing him, and he could not understand her expression, because it was not fear and not anger and not pain. It was something strange, something unreadable and deep. She finally stopped right in front of him, her knees almost touching his, and Her long silver hair fell forward like a curtain, and her face came very close to his, and he felt her warmth pouring over his skin like waves. And even though the wind roared outside and the cold bit into the tent, the air between them felt too warm, too tight, too full, and Ethan felt his chest rising fast like he had just run miles uphill. Then she reached out and placed her hand over his heart, and her fingers were cold, but they pulsed with energy like small lightning trapped inside her skin, and his breath caught in his throat, and he wanted to speak, but he did not know what to say or even if she would understand, and her voice finally broke the silence, soft like snowflakes brushing against a window, as she said the word home. And Ethan blinked and tried to process what she meant, and she said it again, but slower this time, and her glowing eyes looked sad as if remembering something lost. Ethan looked down at her hand on his chest and then back into her eyes and said, "You are safe," and she tilted her head like she was trying to understand the word. And then she closed her eyes and whispered the word again, "safe," and her voice cracked slightly like the weight of the cold had finally reached her. And she moved even closer and leaned against his shoulder, and Ethan froze again, not sure if this was comfort or desperation or something else. He could feel her heartbeat against his arm, and it was fast and strange, not like a human rhythm, but wild and electric, like something alive from deep space, and it scared him a little, but also made him feel a strange kind of peace, like something ancient and forgotten had just returned to him. And then she whispered a word he had never heard before, something soft and alien and beautiful, and when he looked at her, she pointed up toward the sky, and then to her chest, and then to his, and he understood. She was saying she came from the stars, and now she was here, and something connected them suddenly. The ground beneath the tent shook slightly, not much, just enough for Ethan to notice, and the girl sat up straight, eyes wide and alert, as she grabbed his arm tight and pulled him toward the exit. And Ethan didn't move at first, confused, but she looked scared now, really scared, and she kept repeating the same alien word over and over, and it sounded urgent, like a warning, and her grip was strong, too strong for someone who had just been half frozen. And Ethan finally grabbed his jacket and the flashlight and followed her outside into the blizzard. Snow blew in sharp waves, and the cold stabbed through every layer of his clothes, but she didn't stop running, and her bare feet made no sound on the frozen ground, and her silver skin shimmered under the flashlight beam like living ice. And Ethan tried to keep up, slipping and stumbling as she led him away from the camp, down toward the trees and deeper into the forest, and he kept asking, "What is happening?" But she did not answer, only ran faster. Than the sky above them changed, as if the stars blinked out one by one, in a deep humming sound started to echo through the trees, low and vibrating like it came from inside the earth. And Ethan looked up and saw shapes in the sky, dark and slow and moving like shadows of ships too large to be real, and he gasped and stumbled to a stop, and the alien girl turned back and grabbed him again, eyes burning now with blue fire, and she said the word hunter, and Ethan felt a chill colder than the air sink into his bones. She pointed at the ships, and then at herself, and then at him, and he understood somehow. They were after her, and now they would be after him too, and he didn't ask why, because there was no time and no logic, only survival. And she pulled him again, and they ran deeper into the trees, with the humming growing louder and the shadows growing closer, and the snow now falling in thick sheets like the sky itself was collapsing. And Ethan held tight to her hand and told himself over and over that he would survive this somehow, even if he did not understand what this was anymore, because one thing was clear. She was not just some lost girl, and this was not just about warmth in a tent anymore. This was something far bigger and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Ethan ran behind her, with branches slapping against his arms and face, and the snow piling around his boots, and the cold cutting deeper with every step, and he could barely see, but she moved like she knew every tree, every rock, every path in the forest, and her glowing skin lit the way like a living beacon, pulling him forward through the storm. And the sound in the sky grew louder, like a giant engine echoing through the mountains, and the ground trembled with every pulse, like something heavy was preparing to land. She stopped suddenly near a rock formation, covered in snow and leaves and vines, and dropped to her knees and pushed her hand into the earth and whispered something he could not understand, and for a moment nothing happened. And then the ground cracked and split open and revealed a tunnel entrance made of dark stone and filled with glowing veins of blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat, and she looked back at him, eyes serious and full of urgency, and he nodded without asking and followed her inside. The tunnel closed behind them without a sound, and the light inside the stone dimmed but never went out, and Ethan could finally breathe without the wind screaming in his ears, and the girl leaned against the wall breathing fast, and he could see the fear in her eyes, now real fear, not like before, and she said one word over and over, "Hunter, Hunter," and Ethan tried to understand and asked, "Are they coming for you?" But she only shook her head and whispered something softer and looked at him with regret and placed her hand on his chest again. Ethan, his mind raced with questions, but none of them had answers, and she seemed to read his thoughts because she closed her eyes and placed her forehead against his, and a rush of images flooded his vision like dreams made of fire and stars and ships floating in silence and strange symbols written in air, and then screams and bright light, and the girl standing alone on a cold metallic platform as tall armored figures surrounded her and pointed weapons at her, and then her running alone through snow and shadows until she found him. He gasped and stepped back, trying to understand what he had just seen, and she nodded slowly as if to say yes, it was real. And she pointed to herself, and then to the sky, and then to her arm where a faint mark glowed beneath the skin like a map or code, and then she touched his hand, and he felt a small spark like static and saw a brief flash of stars forming a path like a route through space marked by glowing points, and then it vanished, and she looked at him again, and this time he understood something more. She was not just running, she was carrying something hidden inside her, something powerful and important, and now, by helping her, he was part of it, and whoever those hunters were, they would come for both of them now. And Ethan did not know how to fight aliens or fly ships or survive in caves, but he knew how to run, how to hide, and how to protect, and he nodded slowly and placed his hand over hers and said, "We survived together," and she smiled for the first time. A real smile, soft and bright like morning sun on snow. The tunnel suddenly lit brighter, and she turned fast, eyes sharp and alert, and Ethan heard a faint hiss like steam or breath coming through stone, and he grabbed the flashlight even though it was useless here. And they both moved deeper into the passage, and the air changed, grew warmer but thicker like breathing fog, and the walls now shimmered with strange patterns, like ancient writing shifting and moving on their own, and she traced her fingers across them, and the stone opened again, revealing a hidden room filled with strange devices and a large round table glowing with soft light. She walked to the center and placed her hand on the table, and it lit up with a projection of the stars and planets and moving ships, and Ethan stared in awe and confusion, and she zoomed into one planet, a red one, and pointed at it with a sad look, and then pointed at herself, and then at the glowing mark on her arm, and then at him, and Ethan realized something terrible. She was supposed to bring whatever she carried to that planet, but now she could not go back. And for some reason the connection had passed to him, and the mark on her arm began to fade and glow on his. He panicked and stepped back, but it was already done, and she said one word, "transfer," and he felt something inside shift like a door unlocking inside his chest, and he staggered against the wall trying to breathe, and she held him steady and kept repeating, "It's okay," or something close to that. And he finally looked at his arm and saw the mark glowing like a living tattoo, and it pulsed with every beat of his heart, and he knew nothing would ever be the same again. Then the room shook and alarms lit up in colors he had never seen, and the walls showed images of dark ships entering the atmosphere and descending fast, and the girl grabbed his hand and pulled him toward another tunnel, and she was running again faster than before, and now it was not just about her survival or even his, it was something much greater and heavier and older than both of them, and Ethan knew deep down they had started something that would not stop, and the hunters were almost here. The walls around them trembled as the sound of the hunters filled the stone with a deep vibration, and the girl pulled Ethan without looking back, her grip tight and her steps faster than before, and the blue veins in the tunnel walls blinked faster as if warning them to move, and every time Ethan tried to speak, his words caught in his throat because something told him silence was safer, and the farther they ran, the more he felt the mark on his arm grow warmer, like something inside was waking up and responding to the danger chasing them. The tunnel opened into a wide chamber filled with round doors and floating symbols, and the girl stopped for a second, her eyes moving quickly as she searched for something, and she pointed to one of the doors and ran toward it. and the metal slid open with a low hum, and inside was a small chamber with 2 seats, strange belts, and a screen that showed stars. Spinning slowly, and Ethan paused at the entrance, confused by the sudden change from ancient stone to smooth alien metal, but she waved him in and pointed at the seat next to hers, and her face was now serious with no trace of fear, only focus. As soon as he sat down, the belts wrapped around them both, without warning, holding them in place, and the chamber door closed behind them, and the entire room began to shake as if something large and powerful was charging up, and the girl reached toward the console, placing her hand on a glowing circle, and the ship responded with a loud thrum like it had been waiting for her, and the floor beneath them began to rise and the walls turned transparent, showing the dark tunnels falling away below as they rose through a vertical shaft lit by spinning lights and moving symbols. Ethan gripped the arms of his seat as the speed increased, and the mark on his arm glowed brighter in rhythm with the engines, and he looked at the girl, who was now calm. Her silver eyes locked on the display ahead, and he asked, "Where are we going?" But she only replied with a single word above, and the ship broke through a stone ceiling and shot into the stormy night sky like a beam of light, and the snow exploded around them in a whirlwind, and the hunters turned their ships toward the light and began pursuit. Alarms sounded inside the ship, but the girl pressed a sequence of buttons that changed the display into a star map with red lines showing paths and danger zones, and one glowing green path stretching far into deep space, and she looked at Ethan and touched the map near the green line, and the ship turned sharply, heading straight toward the route, and the stars outside stretched into lines as they entered faster motion, and the girl looked at the mark on his arm, then back at the stars, and said the word key, and Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold behind them. The hunters followed, firing beams of dark energy that lit the sky with burning trails, and the ship shook with every near hit, and one of the beams clipped the edge of their ship, making it spin and spark, and the girl gritted her teeth and forced the controls back, and Ethan was thrown sideways, but the belts held him in place, and all he could do was watch as she guided the ship through space, like a bird fleeing from a storm. And then the stars around them flickered, and the ship entered a tunnel of light, and silence fell like a curtain inside the tunnel. The air felt still and heavy, and the girl relaxed slightly, her hands falling from the controls and her eyes closing for a moment like someone catching breath after a long run. And Ethan asked her what now, and she opened her eyes slowly and looked at him and said the word safe for now, and then looked down at his arm and said more words he could not understand, but her tone was soft and full of worry, and he nodded. Even though he had no idea what the future held, she reached into a panel beside her and pulled out a small crystal glowing with the same light as the mark on his arm, and handed it to him with care and said memory, and he held it carefully, unsure what to do, and she placed her fingers on his forehead and closed her eyes, and the crystal warmed in his palm, and he saw visions again, not like before, this time clearer and more focused, showing a lost city buried beneath stars, a council of beings arguing in strange tones, and a decision to protect something ancient, something now hidden inside him. The vision ended, and he opened his eyes, breathing hard, and she looked at him with something like hope and said, "Path must be followed," and he asked, "Where does it lead?" and she pointed at the stars again and whispered, "Home," and Ethan nodded slowly, because even though he didn't know the way, something inside him felt it was true, and he looked out at the swirling tunnel around them and knew the hunters would return. And the ship drifted into a quiet sector of space where no stars shined too close and no signals echoed through the void, and the silence felt thick like space itself was holding its breath. And the girl tapped a few buttons on the glowing console, and the engines dimmed into a soft hum, and a dome of shimmering light surrounded the ship like a protective bubble. And Ethan looked around the strange interior, still trying to believe he had left Earth just hours ago and now floated among stars with a silver-skinned alien girl who had trusted him with something beyond understanding. She stood from her seat and motioned for him to follow, and they walked through a narrow hallway filled with glowing panels and strange symbols pulsing slowly like a sleeping heartbeat. And at the end of the corridor, a round door opened on its own, revealing a small room with a pool of soft blue light rising from the floor like mist, and she entered without hesitation and stepped into the light, and her skin sparkled and shimmered as if the mist was reading her or healing her, Or maybe both, and she turned to him and pointed at the light and said, "Restore," and Ethan hesitated but nodded and stepped into it. Warmth surrounded him like a gentle wave, and his body relaxed in a way he had never known before, and the cuts on his hands from the forest began to close, and his mind cleared, and he felt a strange calm settle deep in his chest, as if the ship itself was learning him and cleaning every fear from his thoughts. And when the light faded, they stood facing each other, and she placed her hand over the mark on his arm and whispered a name that did not sound like a name, but felt like it belonged to him. He asked her what it meant, and she looked up into his eyes and said, "Chosen," and he swallowed hard, trying to understand why him. Why not someone stronger or smarter or trained? But she only repeated the word with more certainty and stepped back, opening a new panel in the wall, revealing a sphere filled with tiny points of light moving like fish, and she reached in and pulled out one of the lights and pressed it gently against his forehead, and the sphere disappeared and was replaced with a projection of a distant planet covered in crystal towers and glowing rivers and endless green skies. She explained through gestures and short words that this world was once her home, a peaceful place filled with knowledge and harmony, until the hunters came seeking what could not be allowed to fall into their hands, and the council chose her as keeper of the last fragment of the core, a living memory crystal carrying the entire history and soul of her people. And when the planet fell, she escaped with it hidden inside her until now. And now it had been passed to him, because the hunters could not trace his kind, not yet. Ethan looked down at the mark and felt it pulse again, stronger this time, and his thoughts filled with strange, new patterns like the start of a language he almost understood. And the girl saw it in his eyes and nodded, saying, "Link has begun," and he asked, "How long before they find us?" And she stepped to the window and watched the darkness outside, and said, "Soon, because they never stop, they never sleep, and they always find what they are after." And Ethan felt his stomach tighten, but also a fire build in his chest, because this time they would not find someone helpless. He asked her if there were others like her, and she nodded, pointing to one of the stars in the projection and saying, "Safe zones," and Ethan saw flickers of hope in those lights. Small outposts where others like her had fled, where pieces of the truth had survived, and she told him they needed to reach them one by one to rebuild the network and awaken the core, and only then could the hunters be stopped. And Ethan realized this was no longer about escape, it was about purpose, and he had become a part of something far greater than survival. Suddenly the ship beeped and the lights dimmed, and a symbol flashed red on the console, and the girl ran to it, her fingers flying across the buttons, and she turned to him and said, "Trace found," and Ethan rushed to her side as the screen showed a hunter ship moving fast through space, its shadow long and sharp like a spear, and she activated the defenses, and the bubble around them shimmered darker, and the engines roared back to life, and the stars around them stretched as the ship turned sharply and flew toward the nearest safe zone. They braced as the first energy beam flew past them, barely missing the hull, and Ethan held onto the wall as the ship spun and darted between debris fields and old satellite ruins, and he could hear the low rumble of the hunter's engine growing closer. And he asked how many, and she whispered 3, and his heart pounded as he realized they were not outrunning just one but a squad, and she told him to hold on as she flipped the ship toward a collapsing asteroid belt, using the chaos as cover. The ship dodged falling rocks and waves of burning gas as the girl guided them through with sharp turns, and Ethan watched in awe as she moved with instinct, like she had flown through death more times than he could count. And the ship finally burst out of the belt and entered another tunnel of light, and silence returned for now. And Ethan sat down, breathing hard, his eyes on the girl, who now stood motionless, her hands still on the console, her shoulders trembling slightly as she whispered a word under her breath that sounded like "soon," and Ethan knew this was just the beginning. Asterisk. The tunnel of light ended, and they entered a quiet part of space filled with floating crystal debris and gentle, glowing orbs drifting like jellyfish across the stars. And the girl guided the ship to a small moon, barely visible among the rings of a massive gas planet, and as they approached, Ethan saw tall stone spires rising from the moon's surface like fingers reaching toward the stars, and the ship slowed and landed between 2 of those spires, where a soft green light blinked. Slowly, as if waiting to be awakened, they stepped out together into the thin moon atmosphere, and Ethan was surprised that he could breathe and walk without pain, and the girl walked ahead following a narrow path between the spires and strange symbols lit up on the stones as she passed, and Ethan followed close behind, watching the lights react to her steps, and the mark on his arm glowed again in rhythm with the lights in the air smelled faintly like metal and flowers, and time itself seemed to slow down in that place. At the end of the path stood a door made of glowing threads woven like fabric across stone, and she touched it gently and whispered something soft, and the door dissolved into light, revealing a room carved deep into the moon, filled with floating crystals and smooth round chairs and glowing pools of water that rippled without sound. And she entered first and pointed to one of the pools and said, "Core Echo," and Ethan knelt beside it and saw his reflection flicker and shift until another face appeared, not his, not hers, but a being with many eyes and skin like liquid silver. The Echo began to speak in a voice that entered his mind instead of his ears, and it showed visions of the first people of her world and how they created the core to hold their history and knowledge and power, and how they chose guardians to protect it across time and space, and how each time a guardian passed the core fragment, the next would be stronger and more connected, and now that peace lived in him and had begun to shape him. Even if he could not yet feel it fully, the girl watched him closely, and when the vision ended, she said, "Evolve," and pointed to a chamber behind the pool where soft light pulsed from the floor, and Ethan stood slowly and stepped inside, and the door closed behind him, and the light surrounded him like warm rain, and the mark on his arm spread across his chest like roots of light, and strange shapes formed above him like maps written in stars, and he felt a deep pulse in his chest as if the knowledge inside was trying to open and grow. He saw memories that were not his, flying machines that floated above cities without engines, towers built from sound and color, creatures of light dancing through the skies. And then he saw war, ships burning homes, the hunters tearing through peaceful places like storms and screams without end, and he felt pain and loss and rage all at once, and his knees buckled under the weight of it, and the chamber held him steady like arms, lifting him and guiding him. And then slowly the light faded, and the mark on his chest dimmed back to its shape on his arm. The door opened, and the girl stood there watching him, and he looked different now, eyes sharper, posture stronger, and something in his mind more focused and calm. And she stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest and nodded and said, "Ready?" And he asked for what, and she replied, "War," but her voice was not angry. It was steady, like someone who had accepted what must come and now trained for it. And Ethan looked down at his arm, then up at the ceiling of the chamber, and whispered, "I will not fail." They returned to the ship, and the map lit up, showing many more paths and blinking lights across distant stars, and the girl pointed to one far point marked in red and said, "Final gate." And Ethan asked, "What is there?" And she said, "The core root." And he understood it was the heart of everything, the center from which all truth began, and where the final stand would be, and they needed allies and strength before reaching it. And he asked how much time, and she looked at the stars and said, "Less than we want." Suddenly a blue light flashed on the ship's edge, and she rushed to the console, her hands flying across controls, and the display showed a nearby signal under attack, and she pointed to it and said, "Survivor," and Ethan nodded before she asked, and the ship lifted into the sky again, and they followed the signal through asteroid rings and glowing gas clouds until they reached a broken ship spinning slowly in space with one life sign flickering weakly inside. She guided the ship close, and Ethan suited up without fear now and crossed the narrow tunnel between ships and forced the hatch open, and inside found a wounded alien figure, barely conscious and covered in glowing wounds, and he lifted them gently and brought them back, and the girl connected tubes and healing lights to stabilize the survivor and said, "Brother," and Ethan watched her face soften as the figure's breath returned, and he understood they had found one more piece of the past and one more reason to fight. The ship turned again, and the stars stretched as they jumped forward, and behind them shadows moved silent and fast, and the hunters had found another trail, and the race toward the core had begun again. The ship moved through the final passage where stars pulsed in slow rhythm like a heartbeat, and silence filled every corner like the calm before a great storm. And Ethan stood beside the alien girl, now fully awake to what lived inside him and what path he had chosen. And the survivor they rescued still rested in the healing pod covered in soft blue light, while the girl adjusted the ship's course with steady hands and calm breath, and the mark on Ethan's arm glowed brighter than ever, lighting up half the cockpit like a rising sun made of memory and fire. They reached the edge of the final sector, a dark zone, where no light escaped and no signals returned, and the girl said this place was once the home of the first gatekeepers, the creators of the core, and now it was taken over by the hunters who turned it into a graveyard of broken worlds, and they needed to enter the core route hidden at the center of the ruins to awaken the last defense that could stop the hunters forever. And Ethan asked if the core would still accept him, and she said it already had. The moment the transfer began, the ship broke through the outer field, and strange fragments of cities floated in silence. Massive towers cracked in half and drifting through space like frozen ghosts of a lost empire, and statues of beings with wings and horns and long-forgotten armor stood shattered across the ruins, and in the center a pulse called to Ethan, pulling at the mark like a magnet, and he closed his eyes and saw a path. Only he could see, glowing faintly like a trail of fireflies leading deeper into the broken zone. They moved carefully, weaving between sharp debris and strange energy fields that hummed when touched, and Ethan guided the ship by instinct, trusting the new vision inside his mind, until they reached a large sphere, cracked open like an egg with tunnels leading into darkness, and the girl said this was it, and if they failed here, everything would vanish. And she placed a small crystal in his palm and said, "You carry all of us now." And Ethan nodded, without fear, without doubt, only purpose. They entered the tunnels on foot, walking through halls once filled with light, and now only echoes and dust, and the walls whispered to him with voices that did not belong to anyone being, but to all of them, like a choir of lost souls waiting for him to speak. And he placed his hand on a sealed door, and it opened like water parting, and inside stood the chamber of memory, with a giant tree made of light rising through the floor and touching the ceiling, and the roots stretched across the walls, glowing with the same pulse as his arm. The girl stepped back and watched as Ethan walked forward, his breath steady and his heart open, and the mark on his skin shined until it formed lines in the air, connecting with the roots, and the tree responded, opening like a flower and releasing a storm of light that swirled around him, lifting him from the ground and showing him every memory of every guardian before him, each one standing where he stood, each one adding a piece to the legacy he now carried. The light entered his chest, and the pain was sharp, like being broken and remade at once, and he cried out but did not fall, and the girl shouted his name, though he never told her what it was, and the tree's final gift entered him, a golden spark that held the will of the first builder, and with that spark came knowledge of what needed to be done and how to do it. And when he landed gently back on the floor, he was no longer just Ethan, he was the voice of the last gate, and the final key alarms screamed as the hunters arrived, dozens of black ships circling the broken planet and firing energy beams toward the ruins. And the girl ran to him and asked if it was done, and Ethan said yes, but they needed to buy time for the core to awaken. And she nodded and handed him a small orb and said, "This will call the allies if they are still out there," and he activated it and sent the signal across the stars, and the orb burst into the sky like a flare of pure hope. They returned to the ship, dodging blasts and shaking from the impact of nearby strikes, and Ethan took the controls, now hands moving with strange precision as if the ship obeyed not his fingers but his will. And the girl watched him with pride and wonder and said he had become more than she had ever hoped. And the mark on his arm pulsed again, this time spreading light across the cockpit and sending a wave of energy toward the hunters, forcing some ships to fall back. Reinforcements arrived through folding gates, small ships marked with the signs of old alliances, led by survivors from scattered worlds, and the girl's brother, now awake, stood beside her, ready to fight again, and they formed a shield around the core route, buying the time Ethan needed to unlock the last barrier. And with one word spoken in a language that never existed on Earth, the core route bloomed, and light swallowed the darkness, pushing back the hunters with a force older than war itself. When the light faded, Ethan stood at the center of a new circle, a beacon that would guide others home, and the girl stepped beside him, smiling not with joy but with peace, and said, "We are no longer lost." And he looked at her, the girl who once only wanted warmth and now had given him a galaxy, and he whispered, "Thank you," not knowing if she understood, but knowing it did not matter because the future had begun. and it was burning bright in his hands.